Arizona. Dr. Hilary Emerson has experience in fate and remediation of radionuclides, including actinide elements. She enjoys working on systems spanning from laboratory to field scale. And since joining PNNL in 2019, her work has focused primarily on site characterization studies and development of remediation technologies for radionuclides. Hilary earned her PhD in environmental engineering and science at Clemson University. So during and after the presentation today, I encourage you to submit any questions you have to the chat box, which will be monitored and will be passed along to Jim and Hilary for discussion. And again, for those who signed on late, I highly encourage you to change your name in your profile by hovering over your name and changing your name to your first and last name so we can see who's on the webinar today. So with that, I will turn it over to Hilary to kick us off.
Thank you, Alicia, for that introduction. So I'll get right to it. So today we're going to talk about environmental chemistry, characterization, and remediation of uranium. And we've broken this talk into kind of 4 subsections to help you all follow along. And in the first 2 subsections, we'll talk about general and environmental chemistry of uranium. And we'd like for you guys to understand that the speciation and mobility of uranium is going to be primarily driven by its oxidation state and available sorbents and complexants. And then in the third section, we'll go over some characterization techniques for uranium, including both direct and indirect measurement methods. And lastly, we'll talk about some technologies for remediation of uranium in the subsurface. So to begin with, uranium is element 92 on the periodic table. It is part of the actinide series, and it is the heaviest naturally occurring element. And so that has a small caveat because there are some trace quantities of heavier actinides that have been naturally produced in the environment, but uranium is the heaviest that's available in mineable quantities. And so there are 3 natural isotopes of uranium in the environment, and that includes uranium-238, uranium-235, and uranium-234, with uranium-238 being the primary species with about 99.3% of the abundance, and uranium-234 being the least abundant species. And each of these isotopes have fairly long half-lives, with uranium-238 with the longest half-life of about 4.5 billion years, and uranium-234 with the shortest half-life, but still of about 240,000 years. And so the important isotope for nuclear fission is uranium-235, which is a fissile isotope that can split when it interacts with a thermal neutron. Uranium-238 is also used in nuclear reactors. It is a fertile element, meaning that it can absorb a neutron and then decay from uranium-239 down to plutonium-239, which is also fissile. So both of these isotopes can be taken advantage of in a nuclear reactor. And so the next thing that I wanted to point out is that these uranium isotopes go through quite long decay chains, forming many different daughter products before they finally reach stable isotopes of lead. So as an example, the uranium-238 decay chain includes a uranium decay by an alpha emission to thorium-234, and then 2 beta decays to reach our uranium-234 isotope. And then uranium-235 has a different decay series known as the actinium decay series. And both of these, we can take advantage of their measuring their daughter products and the stable lead isotopes that form at the end to date and understand how long uranium has been present in a system in the natural environment. And so moving along, the oxidation state of uranium is one of the most important factors when we think about how it will behave in the natural environment. And generally, we can have 4 different oxidation states. That's +3, +4, +5, and +6. However, the +3 oxidation state is unstable in water and air and is generally only observed in the solid phase. And the +5 oxidation state is also has a very narrow range of stability in solution and in the solid phase. So the primary oxidation states that we see in the environment are the +4 and the +6 oxidation state. And they both have quite different behavior in the environment, with the +4 oxidation state having a fairly low solubility and a fairly high complexation affinity and sorption affinity, with the +6 oxidation state also having a pretty high complexation affinity, but lower sorption affinity and higher solubility. So we often see uranium-6 in solution and uranium-4 primarily in the solid phase. And on the right here, I have a Porbet diagram of uranium speciation in pure water. And so the dotted lines on this figure represent the stability field of water. And each of these areas represent the major uranium species under those conditions. And so it might not include, it might not include, sorry, it it might include more species than just that one, but you're seeing the major species. And so this is a good way to look at a simplified diagram to understand uranium speciation. And so what we see is that under reducing conditions, the primary species that we'll see is uranium-4, and then under oxidizing conditions, higher on the figure, we'll see uranium-6 species. And then as we increase in pH, we increase in hydrolysis or complexation of hydroxide, which we go from forming cation species in solution to neutral and then negatively charged species. And those have a big effect on how uranium will sorb in the environment, as well as their solubility. And so moving along, just to help drive home the increase in hydrolysis with pH, this is a figure showing uranium-6, and you can see that above pH of about 5, uranium-6 will be present as hydrolysis species in solution. And then for uranium-4, hydrolysis begins even lower, around pH 2. But overall, uranium often complexes with hard bases, primarily including hydroxide and carbonate in the natural environment, but also including things like phosphate, sulfate, and fluoride, and less so nitrate and chloride. And so now we'll move a little bit further into uranium in the environment. And so before we talk a little bit more about speciation, we'll talk about its abundance in the environment. And so uranium is present in the Earth's crust at a low part per million concentration. It's also going to be higher in certain mineral phases. For example, phyllosilicates have on average a concentration of about 20 parts per million. And then zircon, which is a zirconium silicate, is one of the highest phases with uranium at about 2,500 parts per million. And so as another example, if you look at the graph on the right, we have uranium deposits across the US in red, but more importantly, we also have uranium deposits that are associated with phosphate in pink. And so as we talked about uranium complexing strongly with phosphate in solution, it's important to note that we can also form low solubility mineral phases with phosphate. And so then looking at uranium in solution in the environment, we generally have a low concentration of uranium in seawater of about 3 parts per billion. But then if we look at groundwater, that concentration can be much more variable. And so under reducing conditions, we generally see very low concentrations of uranium, and that's because it's present in the +4 oxidation state. However, when we get into more oxidizing groundwater, we can have higher concentrations of uranium-6 in solution because it has a higher solubility, and it can also complex with other constituents in groundwater to give it a wider variability in solubility. So this is important because we need to keep in mind that the EPA maximum contaminant limit for uranium in drinking water is just 30 parts per billion. However, we've also had different types of releases of uranium to the environment, and I won't go into a lot of detail, but I just wanted to give a few examples. So starting with mining operations, as you can see, this quite large open pit mine in Canada, you can see that that is going to have some impacts on the environment. But then we also have some uranium releases from in situ leach operations and also uranium mill tailings disposal. And in addition, you'll hear a little bit more about some of the uranium releases from nuclear weapons development from Jim. And then there are also some potential releases from secondary activities like phosphate mining, and also secondary impacts to aquifers from other waste streams. For example, it's been shown that uranium, high elevated uranium is often associated with elevated nitrate in groundwater. So sometimes oxidizing wastewaters that don't contain uranium could also leach it from the subsurface and increase uranium in groundwater. And so moving along, there's kind of these 4 major types of reactions that we need to think about when we think about uranium in the environment. And that includes complexation that we talked about primarily with inorganic ligands, but can also occur with things like organic solvents and natural organic matter. And all of these different species can impact how uranium sorbs to different minerals in the environment, as well as the precipitation and dissolution behavior. And finally, the importance of redox conditions, because we have our relatively low solubility uranium-4 versus our relatively high solubility uranium-6. And I wanted to give just a few examples of uranium speciation in the environment. And I think that carbonate is one of the most important complexants for uranium. And these figures help highlight that as carbonate concentrations in solution increase, you can see a decrease in uranium sorption in the alkaline pH range. So as an example, the figure on the left shows uranium, on the top left, uranium sorption with respect to pH. And you can see that as the carbon dioxide concentration increases, you see a decrease in sorption. And then we see a similar phenomena in the figure on the right, except for that we're looking at the dissolved uranium with respect to pH. But you can also see that uranium in the aqueous phase increases because it's not sorbing as the pH increases. And so next, I wanted to show another Porbet diagram, but this one takes into account the major constituents in groundwater at the Hanford site as an example. And some of those constituents include carbonate, calcium, and silica. And as you can see here, this significantly changes the speciation of uranium, and we can see that we're forming these calcium uranyl carbonate species in the alkaline pH range, and then starting to form some mineral phases too, depending on the concentration of uranium in groundwater. And on the neutral pH range, we can form uranophane, which is a calcium uranyl silicate mineral. And if we have reducing conditions, it's very likely that we'll form things like uraninite. And so I wanted to use this to transition to talk about some of the solid phases that we often see in the environment. And so again, when we have reducing conditions, we often see uranium dioxide or uraninite with lower concentrations in the groundwater because of the lower solubility. And then under oxidizing conditions in groundwater and also unsaturated vadosome conditions, we can see higher concentrations of uranium under different conditions, but with uranophane being one of the more common phases. However, it's not that simple. Going back to some of our major complexants, they can also form different solid phases in the environment. And there have actually been more than 200 uranium minerals identified, many of them uranium-6 minerals, but also some uranium-4 and other oxidation states as well. So it's important to keep in mind that these major complexants in solution can also form some solid phases in the environment. And so before we transition over to some of the characterization, I wanted to end with an aqueous speciation diagram that shows all of the species that we might see. So we've seen the simplified Port-Bay diagrams, but this shows that we can see in the neutral and alkaline pH range, we primarily see these uranyl carbonates and calcium and magnesium uranyl carbonate species, whereas as we move into the acidic range, we primarily see the uranyl cation and also uranyl sulfate species. And these are important to understand because they'll directly correlate with the potential for sorption and precipitation in these environments. And so now we'll move into some of the techniques that we use for characterization of uranium. And so to begin with, I wanted to highlight that there are definitely a lot of challenges when we think about characterization of uranium in the field. We need to have an understanding of the historic release information, subsurface geology and potential heterogeneity, and also the detection limits of our different methodologies. And so as an example, this is a map of the uranium of the Hanford Site, and in gray, we have the Central Plateau. And this area is quite complex. It has 884 soil waste sites, more than 900 structures, and 177 liquid radioactive waste tanks. And so as you can imagine, characterizing the fate of uranium in the system is quite complex. But we'll go ahead and give you a few examples of some of the techniques and the scales of those techniques that you can use. So to begin with, gamma spectroscopy is a great method and can be used in borehole logging and also surface arrays. And you can detect both uranium and some of their daughter products like bismuth-214, which has a fairly easy to detect gamma. And then there are also indirect methods that can allow you to survey a much larger area. So some of these geophysical methods that we use can't directly identify uranium, but they can identify other indicators of waste. For example, changes in water content in the vadosome and also changes in ionic strength in both the vadosome and groundwater. And so then, once we have an idea of the broader scale of contamination, we can move into looking at some other more direct methods and indirect methods when necessary for measuring uranium in groundwater, sediment, and even plants. So to begin with, in solution, there are a lot of different techniques for measuring uranium, but some of the major analytical techniques are listed here, and mass spec technologies generally have the greatest or the lowest detection limits for uranium for total and the isotopes. Alpha spectroscopy also has fantastic detection limits for different isotopes of uranium, but preparation can be much more difficult or time consuming. But then there are also some methods that we can use to take advantage of measuring the oxidation state and also speciation of uranium. For example, kinetic phosphorescence analysis is a common method used for measuring uranium with fairly good detection limits. And then here in the figure on the right, you can see 3 spectra for uranium in different solutions. And this is a fluorescence spectra, and in A and B, these are uranium carbonate species, and then on the bottom is a uranyl hydroxide species. And so that shows how we can take advantage of the different spectra that we'll see for different species. And then in the bottom is just kind of a summary of some UV-vis absorption maxima for different uranium species and emission maxima for fluorescence for different uranium species. But the important thing to remember is that there are limitations to all of these techniques in terms of interferences and detection limits, and we often need to incorporate some pre-concentration or chemical separation methods. And then in the event of trying to measure a total concentration in a sediment or other solid phase sample, we might employ some dissolution methods. And so then in the event of running alpha spec, we would need to go through a source preparation method as an example, and then finally analytical measurements. And so just a few examples of some of the concentration and separation methods for uranium. So we can employ some physical methods, such as manganese oxide, co-precipitation, but we can also take advantage of some of the great anion exchange resins that are out there. And as an example, we can use some strong base anion exchange resins to separate uranium in strong acids by forming uranium nitrate and uranium chloride anions. And there are also some that we can use for separation of uranium in groundwater by taking advantage of some of those negatively charged uranium carbonate and calcium uranyl carbonate species that form. And as you can see here in this figure, we get very good separation of uranium with this Dowix resin, just as an example. And so moving on, when we're trying to detect uranium in sediments, there are different types of methods, direct and indirect, and also destructive and non-destructive methods. And some have better detection limits than others, and that needs to be taken into account, as well as the goal of using those methods. And so with some of the surface phase characterization techniques that I'm going to show, these are often used in conjunction with multiple techniques as complementary methods to help understand the speciation of uranium. And ideally, once we understand the speciation, we can predict how mobile it will be in the environment. And so here I have an example on the left of a map constructed with an electron microprobe. And this is a great surface sensitive technique for looking at morphology and also the elements with which uranium is associated. And then on the right at the top in A and B, we have a micro X-ray fluorescence map that shows a particle with uranium and iron co-associated. And then in D, we have another great surface phase technique known as scanning electron microscopy. And this is an image from Nick Kafoku's previous work that shows an iron pyrite phase that was bioreduced and incorporated uranium. And they were actually able to use some beamline techniques, including X-ray absorption near edge structure and extended X-ray absorption fine structure to probe the oxidation state and coordination of uranium to confirm that it was incorporated into that phase as a uranium-4 species. And so the last technique that I wanted to highlight is transmission electron microscopy. And this is kind of the smallest scale that we can go to. And with this technique, I have two examples. On the left is some images where they identified uranium silicate mineral. You can tell by the morphology, these kind of white spiny structures, and also based on measurement of the lattice parameters, which was done based on the image in part D. So you can actually see the coordination of the layers of the mineral as it formed. And on the right is a copper uranyl phosphate phase that was identified by transmission electron microscopy. And so I wanted to end this discussion on direct characterization methods, just showing you some of the detection limits. And it's going to be really important to keep in mind that there are limitations with a lot of these direct analysis methods, which is why we often employ some indirect methods. And so if you'll give us just a moment, I'm going to transition it over to Jim so that he can take it from here.
So hopefully that same slide is up. So the surface phase characterization that Hilary described is needed to define what form the uranium is in, whether it's in an untreated sediment or what I'll be talking about in the rest of the talk, how it changed during remediation treatment. For compliance monitoring, aqueous uranium concentrations are needed with or without, get that cursor to show up, with or without excuse me, treatment. And this can be done with sediment cores in either leach experiments, which kind of approximate field scale groundwater flow, or in liquid extractions, which I'll describe in the next few slides. Now, I'd like to point out that these aqueous concentrations that can be measured have very low detection limits, lower than surface phase techniques. So they're useful for most field sites, even at very low uranium concentrations. So you get a measure of what uranium is leaching out of the sediment, but you do need those surface techniques to tell you what exactly it's leaching from. So getting into the liquid extractions. Extractions have been used for decades for a variety of metals, and there are advantages. They're good, inexpensive screening tools. And there are disadvantages too, that because they only give you sort of approximate mass. A series of 6 extractions we commonly use for uranium, I'm kind of showing in a stack diagram here. The aqueous and adsorbed uranium are actually well defined in extractions, but these next 4 are all solid phase uranium species, and they're operationally defined. So basically we go from weak acids to stronger acids, and 1 or more phases are dissolved. In general, the weak acids dissolve high solubility, what I'm going to bin as high solubility uranium minerals, carbonates and hydrosilicates, bolt-woodite and uranophane. And then the stronger acids dissolve uranium in iron oxides and phosphates and titanomagnetite, things like that. So in general, the aqueous adsorbed things at this stand are the most mobile uranium phases, and some of the high solubility phases are mobile. But these phases down here are typically not very mobile. So here's an example where I'm comparing a 1D leach experiment result to extractions. And I'll start with the 1D leach. So on the x-axis, this is basically time, but I'm plotting it in terms of pore volumes, and I did actually put it in on a log scale. Vertical axis is uranium concentration. This is a contaminated sediment, and when you inject water, groundwater in one end and collect the sand at the other end, you see initially high uranium concentrations coming out, and levels off to a low concentration for a very long period of time. And notice that this concentration didn't go to zero, so the sediment is still slowly releasing uranium. And we can actually integrate all the uranium we got out under that, so we can get a total mobile mass. And if we simulate this experiment, we can also get a uranium release rate. Now that total mass that we got from that experiment, I've kind of plotted on this left side in this blue bar. And so we can compare it to the extractions, which on that same sediment, we have aqueous adsorbed, high solubility phases, low solubility phases. And you can see that aqueous and adsorbed uranium leached out, and some of these high solubility phases dissolved too and then leached out, but these ones do not. There's another extraction we commonly do for uranium. It's a pH 9.3 carbonate extraction for about a month and a half. That's this purple bar here, and it's approximately equivalent to the leach. So I'll be using these different things further in the presentation when I talk about remediation. And I'm really going to focus most of the slides on phosphate, either at Hanford, phosphate treatment either at Hanford or at Rifle, Colorado. And then I'll also touch a little bit on use of ammonia gas for beta-ozone remediation. So first, at the Hanford site, a little bit of background. The Hanford 300 area shown here, and I think this picture is from the 1950s or maybe early 1960s, but there was a lot of machining of fuel rods done here and development of chemical separation processes done in various facilities here. The waste was dumped into the north process pond, south process pond, as I'm showing here. The waste was primarily acidic waste, wasn't always acidic waste, but there were also other metals dumped with the uranium and the acids as well. So in the mid-1990s, the ponds and cribs were dug up, leaving low uranium in the sediments below. However, for decades after this initial cleanup, the uranium concentrations persisted. There's a seasonal uranium cycle. When there's high river stage, the groundwater backs up into the beta-ozone a bit, and more uranium leaches down into groundwater. And this has been extensively studied. All I'm showing in this diagram is in 1994, after the initial cleanup, you see a uranium concentration, and 10 years later, you see a little bit different, but uranium is present in nearly the same location, so it's really persistent. The uranium concentration is low, so the main remediation technology is being used as monitored natural attenuation. It does exceed drinking water concentration, but it's not used for drinking water. Phosphate is used in targeted areas to decrease uranium leaching. Now, PNNL's role was to develop the polyphosphate remediation technology. That was Don Wellman, and it was tested in the lab. CHPRC, who is a site contractor, implemented the remediation technology at field scale. PNNL supported the field scale injections with surface and cross borehole electrical resistivity measurements to track injections. And also we supported in characterizing the sediments before and after the phosphate treatment. And that's what I'll be describing. And the four things I'm gonna touch on are, first, why are we using phosphate other than it works? And I'll talk about mechanisms a bit, but then the next three subjects are really larger scale engineering issues. How much phosphate should you use? Why are we using either polyphosphate or calcium citrate phosphate? And then where do we place the phosphate in the subsurface? Is it for source area treatment or permeable reactive barrier treatment? So first of all, just why are we using phosphate? This is the it works slide. So shown on the right side here are two column experiment results in the lab. The red one is untreated and the green one is treated. I put the, and this goes for about 450 pore volumes, or it was about 6 months long. So quite a few pore volumes of water were flowed through there. The uranium concentration, I put on a log scale, so it doesn't, it kind of compresses the high concentration a bit, but I did that for a reason. But if you look at the cumulative uranium leaching out of the sediment, you can see that there's a considerable difference between untreated and treated. So about 2/3 of the uranium was sequestered by treating the sediment with phosphate. Now, the reason I put this on a log scale is these gray bars shown here are stop flow events where we column experiment typically runs at a constant flow rate, but at these time periods, we literally stop the flow for either 200 hours or 1,000 hours for these. And there's behavior that shows up there that is actually really interesting. For the untreated sediment, we see the uranium concentration increases. And this just tells us that there's some slow release of uranium from the sediment. Now, it may be that the uranophane that's in these little fractures is slowly dissolving and or diffusing out of these fractures. This is an image that Hilary showed earlier. So that's in the untreated sediment, but interesting, in the phosphate treated sediment at these stop flow events, you actually see the uranium concentration decrease. So it's the same sediment and uranium is still being released, but because there's phosphate present, there's actually some uptake of uranium by the phosphate phase. So this is just hinting that this could be used as a permeable reactive barrier. And this slide is a little bit underwhelming, but this is actually a summary of all of the results of the phosphate treatment. So we actually have 26, there were actually more than 20, but there's 20 or 10 pre-post pairs of 1D leach experiments, like the one I just showed you. And in the pre-injection, about 40% of the uranium leached out of that sediment. But 6 months after the field scale treatment, core holes were drilled, and in those sediments, and they were drilled about 3 feet away from where those pre-injection samples were taken at the same deck, about 1/3 of the uranium leached out, so about 13% of the uranium leached out. Now, to compare those leach experiments to the extractions, which are these stack bars, the aqueous and adsorbed uranium, you can see it here, is smaller after phosphate treatment. The high solubility phases are also smaller, and the low solubility phases are larger because of treatment. Now, this is the limitation of the extractions. We presume, we think that the high solubility phases probably mean that there was uranophane dissolving, and the increase in low solubility phases we're forming autunite or an apatite coating on uranium phases, but we really need to identify what those solid phases are. So that goes beyond this screening shown here. And there's been considerable work done with phosphate reaction with uranium, and there are multiple mechanisms that have been identified, from direct formation of autunite, which is a calcium uranyl phosphate, to forming apatite, which then aqueous uranium adsorbs to. The apatite can also coat existing uranium surface phases, and uranium can actually incorporate into some calcium phosphate precipitates. And these 4 mechanisms are likely occurring in some combination at Hanford Site. Now I'll touch on the Rifle site, and there's an additional mechanism that can happen because there's a reducing, the system became a little bit reducing, so we can actually form some uranium-4 and that'll precipitate out. So because uranium concentrations were actually kind of low in the Hanford 300 area, we were able to identify some surface phase components, but not everything. Shown in the diagram on the right side here is Zane's analysis, which gives us oxidation state, and most of the uranium was U6. we know that we form considerable amount of phosphate precipitates, but we were not able to identify what exactly the uranium phosphate association was. Did we form autunite, or was the apatite simply coating uranium surface phases? So we were limited in that with these field sediments. And to touch on that, I know there's a lot on this diagram, but what I'm trying to show here is different studies that have been done with uranium reaction with phosphates. And if you have low concentrations of uranium in the sediment, pretty much all you can do are either extractions or leach experiments. If you want to identify what phases are formed, you actually need much higher uranium concentrations. So you either need to add uranium, as was done in this first study, and then you can figure out what phases are formed, or you need to work with field contaminated sediments that have pretty high uranium concentrations. This one here, in this study, they had about 112 microgram per gram uranium. They did try to do some surface phase analysis, and they were right on the edge of being able to identify what the surface phases were. So you need a little bit more than that to identify what the surface phase is. So that's the kind of balance between, it'd be nice if you could do it all. You could have leach experiments and identify surface phases, but because of the detection limits, there are limitations of what you can do at field sites. Geochemical simulations are also useful to predict what should occur. Uranium will precipitate as a phosphate if high phosphate and low carbonate is present. For the 300 area in the injection solution concentrations, we actually predicted that uranium carbonates will initially precipitate because there was high phosphate and high carbonate there. But over time, as carbonates precipitate, we actually are predicting that autunite should form. So these don't tell you what phases are present, but they will tell you what things should be present and what you could look for in surface phase analysis. So now I'm going to get into some of the sort of engineering upscale stuff. So in the Hanford 300 area, there was a relationship between the amount of phosphate added and how much change there was in the uranium leaching. So basically, more phosphate you added, you had less uranium leaching. So these are all field experiments. And this is with aqueous phosphate, or this is with solid phase phosphate. Now in a lab study with rifle sediments, we're doing something similar, but it's a little easier to show because they're defined lab experiments. So the red, this is cumulative uranium in column experiments. The red is untreated, and then we had low, medium, and high phosphate treatment, and you can see more phosphate, less uranium leach. Now I'm going to do a little bit more with this data here. This sediment had uranium in it, but I was also injecting uranium into the column because that's what occurs in the field. But I sort of analyzed the data a little different. So this is the same data, but I actually, instead of just plotting cumulative effluent, I plotted effluent minus the influent uranium. So then we could separate out how much uranium is leaching from the sediment, and we filtered out the uranium that was coming in as influent. So again, untreated, low, medium, and high phosphate treatment, and more phosphate, less uranium leaching. By the time you got to this level of treatment, basically the plot is showing us that this level of treatment worked very well as a source area treatment because essentially no uranium was leaching from the sediment. But with even higher phosphate treatment, there's actually some of the uranium that was flowing into the column was actually uptaken. So this is actually hinting that the phosphate could act as a permeable reactive barrier. So that's what's shown on this left diagram. Then if we go over to the right diagram where I'm actually plotting just uranium concentration in a column experiment where we have untreated, low, medium, high treatment, to see if this is actually how a permeable reactive barrier would work. And these experiments were at a kind of a high flow rate. They're with more phosphate treatment, you do get some effect as a permeable reactive barrier, but it doesn't work terribly well. So the phosphate treatment is not very effective as a permeable reactive barrier. And that's primarily because the processes of uranium uptake are slow. And if you're flowing groundwater pretty fast, the uranium flux rate through that system is faster than the uranium uptake rate by the phosphate phases. So given that understanding, in the Hanford 300 area, this diagram is showing where treatment was actually done in the field. Again, North Process Pond with high uranium concentration. This part was excavated, and uranium that was left in either the periodically rewetted zone or lower Fados zone. The 57 wells that I'm showing here, there was a screened interval here and also here. So we basically, CHPRC did source area treatment and we did not do a PRB treatment down gradient from the system. So shown on the right side are this outline here is the North Process Pond, and these bright colors are uranium concentrations. And these areas and the dots here are where the wells were drilled and the phosphate was injected. So that's where we did the placement. Now, why did we use either polyphosphate at the Hanford site or calcium citrate phosphate at the Rifle site? Well, this is a kind of a upscale engineering thing needed because we're adding the phosphate as an aqueous solution. You need to be able to inject the solution into a well, and you need maybe tens of hours to move the solution out to a reasonable distance, and then you want it to precipitate. You can't add calcium and phosphate into a solution. It'll precipitate in sections, in seconds, as I'm showing in this little lab picture here. So you need to make a solution that won't precipitate initially. And one approach done for Hanford was using polyphosphates, which is a mixture of orthophosphate, pyrophosphate, and tripolyphosphate that doesn't initially precipitate, but over time, these polyphosphates hydrolyze to orthophosphate, then it precipitates. So this is one way to inject a solution that will precipitate at a later point in time. Another way is to actually complex the calcium. So then a calcium citrate, sodium phosphate solution can be injected without precipitation, and then citrate is biodegraded in the system, and then phosphates are formed. So the polyphosphate approach, which was used at Hanford, was developed by Don Wellman at PNNL, and the calcium citrate phosphate method was actually developed by Bob Moore at Sandia National Labs, and that was also used at the Rifle site, which is what I'm going to talk about next. Was also, again, also a phosphate system, and there are some similarities to the Hanford site. It's located, this old Rifle site is located in southwest Colorado. It's an old uranium mill. Here's an old picture. It's a very nice looking truck here. So there's different uranium phases present compared to Hanford, some more natural phases. And in the mid 1990s, most of the highly contaminated sediments were removed and actually placed elsewhere. That's what I'm showing in this picture. So present day site has low uranium concentrations on it. So it was a good area to test a slightly different remediation technology. Now there's actually a paper by John Zachar comparing the Hanford 300 area to this Rifle site. There was a, so at the rifle site, here's a contour map of uranium concentrations, and right about here, a single well injection was done. These wells are about 4 feet apart, so this is a small scale system here. So it was a single well injection, but there were 3 calcium citrate phosphate injections done. And what I'm showing in all these diagrams here are uranium concentrations over about 2.5 years. This was kind of a collaboration between Mark Regali at Sandia National Labs, John Llewellyn at AECOM Denver, Ken Williams has actually been doing the monitoring of the uranium and other constituents for the last 2.5 years, and myself here. So what you see is the uranium concentration dropped about 3 orders of magnitude, and in the injection well has stayed pretty close to there. Some of the little bit up gradient wells had low uranium concentration, and they're starting to come up. But you can't tell exactly what the uranium retention mechanism is just from the aqueous uranium concentrations. One needs solid phase analysis from cores. There probably are uranium phosphate precipitates formed, but because there's also reduction in the system, that can be a temporary retention mechanism, which is what I'm showing in on these 2 diagrams here. These are separate experiments, not with rifle sediment. It's just with a Hanford sediment that was initially reduced. This is a column experiment where uranium is injected, and here's the effluent uranium concentration. And so initially, the effluent uranium concentration is removed, and then as the system becomes oxic, it's no longer removed, and uranium comes out in the system. So that's what I mean by the uranium reduction will keep uranium immobilized only for a certain amount of time, and once the system is oxidized, it'll come back out into solution. So we're not neglecting the vadose zone. I wanted to show one slide from some work we've been doing with ammonia gas and using that for remediation in the vadose zone. It's a very different technology. It's basically, ammonia gas is a base that you can inject in a gas phase with no water addition. The 5% ammonia gas raises the pore water pH to about 11.5, and aluminosilicates dissolve, things like montmorillonite, illite, muscovite. And over months, as the pH neutralizes, other aluminosilicates precipitate. So that's the main geochemistry that happens. Now, in terms of uranium, what we think happens is uranium surface phases are coated by these aluminosilicate phases. Here's the it works slide, column experiments of untreated and treated sediment after 2 years, and you can see there's a big difference in leaching. These sequential extractions show there's a big difference in the amount of mobile uranium. And but when we did Zanes and XAFS analysis, we actually saw no change in the uranium oxidation state and the elements nearest uranium. So what was initially uranophane was still uranophane. So that's why we hypothesized that the mechanism that causes the decrease in mobilization is aluminosilicate coatings. Okay, so in summary, because uranium is present in multiple solution and surface phases with different mobilities, and co-contaminants are also present that alter uranium phases, remediation requires that multiple phases need to be targeted. The phosphate and ammonia remediation examples that I showed you both decreased uranium mobility, not all the way to 0, and there were multiple mechanisms involved. Also wanted to point out that these treatments are primarily for uranium source area and not permeable reactive barrier treatment. So thank you. Are there any questions?
Great. Thanks, Jim and Hilary, so much. We do have a few minutes left for questions. So we had a few questions from Quinn Dale Howe, and his first question was, what program are you using to model uranium chemistry?
So that's a really good question. Sorry for not sharing that. Most of the speciation modeling that I showed in this presentation was done in GeoChemist Workbench, and some of the simplified hydroxide species were actually just done in Excel.
Excellent, thank you. Dennis had a question about slides 43 and 44, specifically for the rifle column studies. What is the source of discontinuity at 40 pore volumes?
There were a lot of things going on in these column experiments that I didn't describe. That was a stop flow event that we were doing, so uranium concentrations increased. And some of this other weirdness here, I was changing input concentrations of uranium, and at certain points I was also changing the flow rate of uranium. So at the 40 pore volumes here, this was a stop flow.
Excellent, thank you. And you talked about this a little bit, but Chris Halter asked, could this phosphate treatment be a long-term solution for uranium contamination at the Hanford and Rifle sites?
We do think it will be effective long-term, because we think a little bit of autunite forms initially, but then the apatite, which is the main phosphate phase present, over time, uranium will adsorb to that. And then over even more time, over years, some additional autunite will form because there's a little bit of phosphate solubility, and that adsorbed uranium will react and form autunite. Autunite is a very low solubility phase, which should stay stable in this environment for a very long period of time.
Excellent, thank you. Well, with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining today. And just a reminder that today's seminar will be archived on the RemPlex webpage. We've posted the supplementary material related to this topic, including relevant publications, to the RemPlex site. We look forward to presenting our next seminar on the interactions of inorganic contaminants and carbonate participants on July 30th, and more information on that July seminar can also be found on the RemPlex website. I've pasted that link in the chat box, and we encourage you, if you do not receive the RemPlex newsletter, feel free to shoot us an email at remplex@pnnl.gov, and we will get you signed up. So with that, thanks again, and have a wonderful day. Thanks, Jim and Hilary.
Hello.